Well, thank you all for attending this month's session of the KHS Seminar. I am very pleased this month to introduce my dissertation mentor, Dr. Angela Ridgel. Dr. Ridgel is joining us from Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, where she is a full professor in the exercise physiology science program, as well as the assistant director for the Brain Health Research Institute. And Dr. Ridgel's research is obviously, I'm quite fascinated by it, obviously, as a mentee of hers. But just to kind of give a brief overview for those who are joining us today, her interests involve aging, neurological disorders, and how those can limit movement and cognitive function in different population groups. So today we'll have an emphasis talking about individuals with Parkinson's disease. So without further ado, her presentation for this month's series is Optimizing Exercise Intensity to Improve Motor Function in People with Parkinson's Disease. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ridgel. One or two housekeeping notes. I'll mute myself for the moment here. I'll keep an eye on the chat if anyone has any questions, things of that nature. Generally, we'll hold questions a little more towards the end, but please feel free to put those in the chat so we're ready to go as we transition to that portion. So thank you again, and whenever you're ready, I'll let you jump in.
Very good. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to everyone who came today. So, of course, I'd love to be there in person, but we've got to do this for a little bit longer. So today I'm going to talk about the research that we've been doing really since I was a postdoc back in 2006. And so I'm going to give you kind of the history of how we got to the research that we're doing today, and then discuss where we're going to go with that, because we have some pretty exciting directions that we're going to take the lab. So let me start just by, giving you an overview of Parkinson's disease. Many of you already may know what the primary symptoms are, but I'm going to be coming back to these throughout the talk. So really, there are two types of Parkinson's symptoms that we primarily see. The ones that most people are familiar with would be the motor symptoms. Okay, you've probably seen a Parkinsonian tremor, usually a resting tremor in the hands or possibly the lower limbs. You may see individuals who would have very slow movement and potentially gait and postural challenges. A stooped gait is characteristic of Parkinson's. They also have some symptoms such as vocal symptoms, challenges with speaking or very soft voices. And then one of the things that we've focused on specifically is to look at how can you improve rigidity at the joints, usually present at the wrists, the elbow, and the knee, which makes it challenging for these people to move. Okay, the non-motor symptoms really are reported as being some of the most problematic for these people, more so than the motor symptoms. But the primary ones are mental and behavioral issues. They're known cognitive decline with Parkinson's. There are also some other mental challenges that these individuals have, sometimes psychosis and other types of challenges there. One of the characteristics of Parkinson's, which is kind of interesting in the days of COVID, is that they often will lose their sense of smell, and that really oftentimes is kind of a precursor symptom to actually developing some of the more obvious symptoms like tremor. Okay, gastrointestinal issues are challenging, which makes a diet in these individuals need to be focused on. And then we also have other things such as sleep problems, pain, and kind of general anxiety and fatigue in these individuals. So there are a lot of things going on there, which makes it challenging to focus on treatments for those, but it also makes it interesting to try to focus specifically exercise interventions on these different types of symptoms. Okay, so many people ask what causes Parkinson's disease. The challenge to answering that question is that we really don't know. Most Parkinson's that we see in the population is called idiopathic or of unknown origin. And so we don't know what causes it specifically. There's not a cause and effect, but there are kind of 4 major categories for the potential causes of Parkinson's disease. Okay, genetic is one form of Parkinson's. There are specific genetic abnormalities which increase your risk of developing Parkinson's. However, the genetic Parkinson's is rare, or it's most rare in the Parkinson's population as a whole. Okay, there have been some studies that have looked at environments. There specifically, if you look at a map of Parkinson's disease across the United States, what you'll see is that the increased incidence has a tendency to be in urban areas or areas such as where we are in Northeast Ohio, where there's a lot of manufacturing or industry. So there have been suggestions that potentially pesticides or chemicals in the water, in the air could cause Parkinson's. Okay, general inflammation, that could be caused by a number of different things. There's some people that have suggested certain viruses could lead to increased risk of Parkinson's just due to kind of chronic inflammation. And then just generally immune disruption, whether it be, again, from viruses or other mechanisms have been suggested as potential causes. But again, we don't know exactly unless it's a genetic form, which you can kind of cue in on. Generally, most people with Parkinson's have Parkinson's of unknown origin. Okay, one of the challenges for treatment of Parkinson's is that there are many symptoms, which you saw in the previous slide. Not everybody has the same symptoms. There are characteristic symptoms that need to be present in order for it to be clinically diagnosed. The primary ones are the rigidity, the bradykinesia, the tremor, and the postural and gait issues. Okay, but this disease is progressive. So it progresses over time. We usually don't see the symptoms of Parkinson's until you actually have significant loss of the dopaminergic neurons in the midbrain that die in this disease. You get differing levels of severity. There's a range of progression, and that's highlighted here in this graphic. You can see in this, the x-axis is the time in years, y-axis is degree of disability. And you can kind of see here that there's some symptoms that even start to show up before you actually get some of the characteristic ones like tremor and rigidity. One of those, like I mentioned before, is that loss of smell, which is an interesting symptom that you get, potentially depression as well, even prior to these other symptoms and prior to clinical diagnosis. We also get sleep disturbances present, and oftentimes you'll see digestive issues many years prior to when they're actually diagnosed. Okay, again, if we look after the time of diagnosis, we start to see increased risk of more disabling types of symptoms, such as freezing of gait, falls, significant postural stability. And then if you're looking at cognitive challenges, you can see significant cognitive decline, potentially psychosis, and other types of mental disorders. Okay, primarily people who are diagnosed with Parkinson's are put on levodopa medications. These medications only reduce symptoms. Okay, they don't stop progression. They don't treat the disease. They primarily are focused on reducing the tremor, promoting improvements in the posture and gait. And again, they don't treat progression. They don't stop progression. So the challenge with the medication is that you need to increase dosage over time. And there are side effects to those high doses of those medications. And so there's a point at which, there's really not a lot more that you can do. Most severe Parkinson's, they also have deep brain stimulation possibility. That's only done, if medication stops working. It's primarily helpful for reducing tremor, bradykinesia, and potentially the gait challenges. But again, that doesn't stop progression. And so these people oftentimes will have to take medication in addition to having brain surgery and, again, still continue progression. So what we're interested in is focusing on potential treatments that could work in conjunction with the therapies, specifically the medication therapies, and potentially treatments that could promote neuroplasticity. Okay, so we know in adulthood that the nervous system can change and that you can rework the nervous system. Take, for example, stroke. People who have stroke with proper therapy can improve function, and you can get neuroplasticity of those neurons. And so the work I'm going to talk about today is really focusing on treatments that could potentially promote neuroplasticity and changes in how the nervous system works to mitigate the symptoms of Parkinson's. Okay, today I'm going to talk about exercise. Okay, exercise, of course, has a lot of benefits, primarily, cardiovascular benefits. We all know about those. We all know about muscular benefits for resistance training. But there's a lot of research in a lot of different populations, older adults, and a lot of neurological populations that really focuses on exercise and how exercise can improve function of the brain. So this is a schematic which outlines, a lot of different potential mechanisms for the nervous system related changes with exercise. But I want to specifically point out the ones that are relevant for a discussion of Parkinson's disease. I mentioned that potentially increased inflammation could promote Parkinsonian symptoms. We know that exercise can decrease inflammation and can mitigate oxidative damage. Okay, we also, there is evidence in a lot of the animal model work that exercise can increase connectivity between different neurons, improve their efficiency. It can also promote neurogenesis in adulthood, so we can increase the number of neurons and the growth of neurons. And exercise can also promote DNA repair. So if you have challenge, DNA disruptions, there's some evidence to support that. And lastly, exercise also increases mitochondrial function. So if we want to have, the cells be efficient in their aerobic metabolism, it's helpful to have lots of mitochondria and very healthy mitochondria. And the mechanisms of all of these, there are many kind of different levels of mechanisms. One of the primary ones that we've looked into, and actually the work that Sarah did when she was here at Kent, focused on brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a neurotrophic factor that really potentially plays an important role in many of these different mechanisms for improvement with brain and neural function and exercise. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about, again, kind of the history of the work that we've been doing since about 2006. And the primary research questions are really, we have evidence and other people have shown with other modes and modalities of exercise that exercise can promote functional and cognitive improvements, specifically in Parkinson's disease. But the question is, what is kind of the optimal exercise? So what is the optimal mode, the optimal dose, the optimal intensity for exercise to promote not just, cardiovascular and muscular improvements, but I'm focusing more on neural repair and neuroplasticity. Okay, and secondly, I mentioned earlier that Parkinson's is variable in the symptoms that people have and kind of where they are on the continuum of progression. And so exercise is not going to be one size fits all. We need to be able to personalize exercise prescriptions in order to promote improvement to neuroplasticity in individuals. And we need to be able to make that adaptive over time. Okay, because the disease progresses, we have to be able to progress their exercise prescription as well. All right, so let me start with kind of where the beginning of this study. So back when I was a postdoc at Cleveland Clinic around 2006 to 2008, I started working in a biomedical engineering lab, and the individual who was ahead of that lab, Jay Alberts, was actually a cyclist, and I'm a cyclist. So he mentioned to me that he had this thought of the study that he could do in the lab that would focus on kind of how cycling cadence could potentially improve motor function in individuals with Parkinson's, because he had ridden with a friend on a tandem bike several years before, and she had Parkinson's, and she had said that she felt like she didn't have Parkinson's after she rode with him. So he said, you know, you're a cyclist, so let's get this study together. And so we actually took a tandem bike and we put it on a trainer here, an old style trainer. Okay, anybody who rides now knows this is an old style fluid trainer, but it worked at the time. Okay, tandem bikes are helpful in this type of study because they're tied together with a chain. So when this type of tandem bike, whatever one person is doing as far as leg speed, the other person's going to have to follow, because the two cranks are connected together. So what we did in this study, this was an 8-week study, and we brought people in who had Parkinson's, and we trained them on this tandem bicycle 3 times a week. And we randomized the group of people into one of 2 groups. Okay, the first group we called forced cycling. And we called it that because we were forcing the individuals to pedal at a rate that they couldn't necessarily hold on their own. The goal of the trainer on the bike, which was me for most of the study, and I also hired a friend of mine who was also a cyclist to do this with me. Our goal was to maintain about 80 revolutions per minute, which was chosen because that's kind of the go-to cadence for an experienced cyclist. And that was the cadence that Dr. Alberts had focused on with his friend. We took other people, brought them into the lab, and we had another, an SRM based trainer, and we just told them to exercise at the same time as the people in the force group, but we didn't dictate cadence. We only told them to work in a certain heart rate zone. So those people, because they weren't experienced cyclists and because, you know, they had the symptoms of Parkinson's, of bradykinesia, they ended up, as we expected, to pedal at about 66 revolutions per minute. So about, you know, close to 20 differences in the revolutions per minute between those 2 groups. And then we did a clinical scale that's typically done when a person is going to a clinic to see a neurologist. It's called the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, but it encompasses a tremor score, a rigidity score, a gait score, a postural score, and it encompasses all of those characteristic symptoms. So we did this test on these individuals before and after the 8-week intervention, and this graph shows you the results of that. So just to keep in mind, the lower the score, the less the symptoms. Okay, so higher scores represent greater symptoms and greater severity of symptoms. So the red line is the voluntary group, the lower cadence group. The blue line is the forced exercise group. And we did baseline and EOT as end of treatment. And then we also assessed them 4 weeks after they completed the intervention. Okay, so here you'll see that this was a pretty significant decrease in the symptoms, which represented an improvement in the symptoms in the group that did the forced cycling, but the other group, they pretty much just stayed the same. Okay, and interestingly, a lot of people ask me how long these symptoms improvements last. In this particular study, around 4 weeks of doing nothing, they started to drift back towards that baseline that we saw at the beginning of the study. Okay, so this was super interesting for us. We also did another study where we had people come in and do kind of 3 different sessions. One of those sessions was we just had them come in off meds, and we did the UPDRS motor 3 score, and we also did a functional MRI. The second scenario was we had them come in on medication, and we did the UPDRS and did functional MRI. And then the last one was they came in off their medication, and we did one session, one 60-minute session of the forced cycling. Okay, so we had them on the tandem bike, and we were focusing on that high cadence. Okay, so you can see here, if you look at this plot, just focus on the triangles here. Okay, you can see that when they came in on meds, we saw reduced symptoms, which is what we expect, because that's what those medications do. They reduce the symptoms. And then when they came in off meds, and after they had completed one single session of forced exercise, the symptoms were about the same as them being on meds. Okay, so that was really super exciting. The next question is, what's happening in the brain? And so the functional MRI gave us a hint of what was going on there. What I want to do is focus your attention here on the central areas. Okay, these are your putamen, globus pallidus, thalamus areas. If you look at off medications, you can see there's not a lot of lighting up in that area. On medications, you're getting much more activity in that area. And then post forced exercise, it looks pretty similar to what we saw in the on medication state. Okay, so this really suggests that not only are the symptoms reduced, but we're seeing increased activity in the areas of the brain, the basal ganglia areas that are really responsible for those motor outputs. Okay, so this was super exciting. Okay, however, when I came to Kent State, one of the things that we wanted to do was to try to think about how could you use this paradigm in kind of a broader context. Okay, because I will tell you, as the trainer for these patients, I did it myself. It was pretty hard work for the trainer. The trainer had to do about 75% of the work just to get up to speed. And so you couldn't necessarily have a spouse or a friend, as long as they weren't a really strong cyclist, you couldn't have them really do that. Of course, then you'd have to have a tandem bike on a trainer. And so we wanted to make it simpler. Okay, so I was lucky to collaborate with a couple engineers at Case Western Reserve University. And they said to me, we can model the trainer using technology, and we can build a motorized bike, and we can basically tell the motor what to do so that the motor would act like the trainer. I said, okay, that's really cool. I don't know how they do this, but they were able to do that. So we studied the data from those tandem studies, and they were able to actually build a model that would control the motor on a motorized bike. Okay, now one of the features that we found when we did this was that the kind of interplay between the two people on the tandem was a really important component of what we saw as improvements. Okay, so they were working together and working against each other. So there was a constant kind of change, a dynamic change in the cadence over that time period. And so we showed that that was really an important feature. So they integrated that into the model. And so that's why we call this particular bike dynamic cycling. Okay, so it's a motorized bike that will spin the pedals up to higher cadences, but there's a slight dynamic component. It's not just a constant motor output. And that was really an important feature of this. Okay, so this is the first prototype. We didn't build the frame here. We actually got a motorized bike and we replaced the motor and replaced the touch screen, and then built this huge controller box that would allow us to control the motor and then capture the data during each exercise session. Okay, so this work was supported by R21 that I got from NIH. And what we did here was we had people come in and do 3 sessions on this bike. And then we did Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale before and after. We had one group who did the motorized high cadence or dynamic cycling. And then we had another group which just rode this motorized bike in what we called static mode. It basically was just like a bike that you would have at the gym. So motor wasn't on, but they were able to pedal it like a bike you'd see at the gym. Okay. So overall, we saw a 14% improvement in the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale in the dynamic group, but the static group, you know, they pretty much stayed the same, 0.9% worsening. It wasn't statistically significant there. Okay, however, as is true with all kind of you know, studies with humans and the variety of individuals that you get, although we saw this statistically significant improvement of 14%, we saw a decent amount of variability in how the individuals responded. And so this graph is showing you the dynamic cycling group. There were 24 of those people who completed that. This is just showing you the difference in the responses to those people. Okay, the upper graphs here are showing the individuals who improved. The ones on the left-hand side are showing individuals who didn't improve. Okay, and although we saw a significant improvement, and it was pretty dramatic in some of these people, this really shows you that it's not one size fits all. Not everybody responded the same way. So we wanted to try to get a handle on that. And by the way, this work was done by Bobby Phillips, who's shown there in the picture. He's now a professor at Walsh University in the physical therapy program there. Okay. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what Sarah did in the lab, because I can't leave her out. So I'm going to show her work as well. So she continued working with the dynamic cycling. At the beginning, I talked a lot about how exercise can improve cognitive function. And we know that individuals with Parkinson's do have cognitive dysfunction, depending on where they are in the disease progression state. And so what Sarah wanted to do was to focus on cognition and depression. And so we used online program, and we had people come in and do 3 sessions, and we had hoped that we would get improvements in cognitive function, and we didn't in most of them, but we did find an interesting improvement in emotional recognition specifically. Okay, and that was pretty intriguing because we know that individuals with Parkinson's actually have trouble recognizing facial emotions. And that was shown in the literature before. One of the interesting things about that as well is that one of the symptoms of Parkinson's is that they have loss of facial expression because of the challenges of the motor function of the facial muscles. So they have this what's called masked face. And so it's challenging to be able to interpret if a person with Parkinson's are happy, sad, based on their facial expression. And so it's interesting to me that that these people also have challenges with emotional recognition. Okay, Sarah did find an improvement in emotional recognition. We didn't see any improvement in depression, severity, attention, or executive function. But there were kind of 2 caveats to this research. One is that this population that volunteered for this particular study was not particularly cognitively impaired, nor were they high incidence of depression. So of course, that was a challenge to getting a change. If there's no impairment, it's hard for us to get a change. And then, you know, we wanted to see if there were short-term benefits, because there is some evidence that exercise can improve acute cognitive processes. but really probably you need more than 3 sessions to do this. And potentially there's a different mechanism of improvement with the motor symptoms that we saw previously versus the cognitive symptoms. Okay, so we have dabbled a bit in cognition, but didn't have quite the effect that we thought we would in this particular study. Okay, so after doing the 3 sessions, we wanted to see how more sessions would affect their motor function. And so one of my previous doctoral students, Dana Alt, who now is a professor at Grove City College, she wanted to look and see how the symptoms improved over more than 3 sessions. So in this study, she actually did 6 sessions. So she did 6 sessions of dynamic cycling over a 2-week period. And she actually had a control group for this study that was a stretching group. So the individuals came in for the same time and they did stretching instead of dynamic cycling for that time period. And what you'll see here, again, Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. You can see that the red line is the dynamic cycling group. The black circles are the stretching group. And you see that twofold. One, that we did see a significant improvement in the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale in the dynamic cycling group. There wasn't, in fact, the stretching group got a little bit worse early on. And twofold, we actually did a follow-up study, just like I showed you in that first forced exercise study. Here we did follow up only 48 hours afterwards, but we saw continued improvement without any additional exercise there. Okay, so that was really exciting. But what you will see here, which is kind of the theme of the work that we've been doing, is again, if you look at those error bars are pretty big. Okay, so there's a lot of variability in responses. Again, it's not one size fits all. So we need to kind of focus on how can we deal with that challenge. Okay, so what we wanted to do is start looking at how can we potentially predict what an individual would need and how can we maximize that benefit through exercise prescription for individuals at a point in time and over time. Okay, so we collaborated with a couple other people. This was a collaboration with Dr. Beth Fisher at University of Southern California. I actually shipped one of the bikes across the country, went to UPS store, asked them to pack up this motorized bike, and I shipped it to California. So they had a bike out there and they were doing some studies. And they were able to do some progressively longer studies. So these are between 40 and 35 exercise sessions. We were able to capture data from these individuals. And then we did an analysis, which I haven't mentioned up to now, but the variability piece that we integrated into the motor, that dynamic piece, we actually analyzed that by doing what's called entropy analysis on the time data that we captured from the studies. So entropy analysis just means how much are you changing over time a specific parameter. And so we actually, programmed in entropy into that motorized bike. And so we started to look at how changing potentially entropy of cadence throughout exercise sessions could alter benefit that we saw in the people. Okay, so this is just 2 examples. The top plot is an individual who improved their Parkinson's disease rating scale by 4 points. What I want to point out here with the red triangles is that this individual actually had changing entropy. So we changed variability over the exercise sessions. Whereas the person on the bottom, although there is some variation around this kind of middle point, what you'll see is that it's fairly stable. If you do the line of best fit here, it's the change in entropy is fairly stable over the exercise sessions. And this person, they didn't have a UPDRS change at all. So they were pretty stable. Okay, so this really suggested to us that potentially that variability or the entropy changes over the exercise sessions is an important feature. And we wanted to kind of move towards how can we use technology to be able to predict what people would need as far as the characteristics of the exercise, what they would need to optimize their benefit, both within a session and across multiple sessions. And so the solution to this was to develop a paradigm of adaptive exercise therapy. Okay, what do I mean by adaptive exercise therapy? In technology and computer speak, basically the goal of this was to be able to use predictive algorithms to be able to predict how a person, what type of exercise and what characteristics of exercise the people would need in order to maximize benefit. Okay, so this is illustrated in this diagram. The goal of this adaptive controller that we have a couple patents on is to be able to basically plan some sort of exercise based on where the individuals are as far as their clinical symptoms at that point in time, where we want them to be, or the target UPDRS scores, and then use those data to be able to plan not only within a session, but also from one session to another. Okay, so how is it that we're going to do that? Okay. One of the ways in which we started to approach the how are we going to do that question is to try to take data sets that we already had and use those data sets to build predictive models that may help us say, if a person is within a certain characteristic, then we would need to set up their exercise parameters in a given way that would optimize their benefit. Okay, so this work actually hot off the presses. It's available online, but we just got approval of the proofs last week. This work was done by a previous doctoral student, Peter Gates, who's now a research scientist at a company. He was going to do his dissertation work. We were going to do EEG. I was telling Sarah we were going to do an EEG study during dynamic cycling, and he proposed his dissertation at the beginning of March 2020. Okay, so we know what happened at the beginning of March 2020. Unfortunately, of course, we couldn't do any in-person research studies. So Peter loved data and he loves writing predictive models. So I said, okay, here's a bunch of data sets from previous studies. You need to figure out what's going on here and build these models. So interesting, what he found was a couple of things. Okay, one, he started looking at kind of how the individual characteristics can define their improvement as far as demographic variables. And he also was looking into how their effort during exercise could predict their improvement. And so he built these equations where he calculated effort in terms of how much the individuals were able to keep up with the motor. Okay, so they could sit there and let the motor do all the work, and that would be very low effort. We didn't allow them to do that. We asked them to try to participate, but there was a lot of variability in how well the people could keep up with the motor. So he built a couple models and he found a couple of things. One, interestingly, but not unexpectedly, was that people who had higher BMIs or body mass index had a tendency to produce lower effort. Okay, that's not terribly surprising. As an exercise physiologist, that's kind of what you would expect. But it was interesting that we were able to kind of look at that and show that was indeed a potential predictor of improvement. And then he took that even further to build this association in that the mean effort really would be potentially affected by where they are as far as their clinical symptoms, so where they are before the intervention, and that in turn would help to predict their responses. Okay, so again, this is a preliminary model. We haven't been able to test it in a larger population, but it's interesting to try to use the characteristics of the individual and also their performance to be able to predict what they might need. Okay, so all of this work together, we are moving towards what I call SMART cycling, the acronym SMART cycling, and it's called Speed Manipulated Adaptive Rehabilitation Therapy. The goal of this is, of course, is to be able to set up the characteristics of the exercise session to maximize benefits for those individuals. Okay, and so this is actually the second prototype of the bike. So I showed you that old prototype with that big box and looking very clunky. This is the second prototype. We were funded by Davis Phinney Foundation and a tech fund, which is a technology fund in this area, to build the next version. We got this bike right before COVID hit, so I haven't had the chance to test it in Parkinson's. But I have a student who's going to do that any minute now. But here you'll see, again, same bike frame. Instead of that big box and a computer, this is our power supply. We actually were able to upgrade this to use Raspberry Pi as a control language. We don't need a computer anymore. We can download the data directly to a jump drive. And you can see that through the work of some of my students, particularly Brian Dowdell, who was a gamer, I told him you have to make this more gamified. You have to make it more fun. So we came up with this idea of, it's pretty low level here. Anybody who's a big gamer will be like, that's pretty simple, but it works for us initially. The goal of this is for them to keep the hot air balloon above the water. Okay, and in order to do that, they have to produce effort. Okay, so if they don't produce effort and they let the motor do all the work, the balloon will fall into the water. Okay, so we can set the cadence wherever we like here. And then this is how we adjust the resistance level to modulate effort and how much they put in. This also modulates the entropy of the cadence that we set. Okay, so we're able to adjust those settings to modulate effort, cadence, and also the entropy of cadence. Okay, and we're just getting started back up to doing research. So again, with the new bikes that we just got, and the idea of the predictability of the adaptive therapy. We actually recently got a VA merit grant through Dr. Asif Sheikh, who's shown here. He is a neurologist at the Cleveland VA. He and I wrote a grant that was just funded. It's going to start in April. We're pretty excited about it. And then Young Kim, who's a doctoral student in my lab, he's also going to be doing this study for his dissertation research. And so the goal of these two projects are to, again, build upon what we've already done and to really be able to build a predictive model that would integrate wearable sensors to monitor motor improvement and would also allow us to monitor remotely and offsite what individuals are doing on the bike and to be able to capture that data. And eventually our goal is to be able to have computer predictive control of the bike and to be able to do that remotely. So this is the first step towards doing that, and we're pretty excited to get back to research and back to these projects. Okay. So before I conclude, I just want to talk just briefly about another kind of exercise intensity project. I know Sarah put this logo on the flyer that I did. We are part of the SPARKS-3 trial. It is a multi-site phase 3 clinical trial. There are, I think right now they have 18 sites, and one of them is actually University of Utah. We have 4 sites in Ohio, believe it or not, Cleveland Clinic, we're collaborating with University Hospital Case Western, and there's one in Columbus and also in Cincinnati. Okay, so this again is an exercise-based intervention. It is a treadmill intervention, but the goal of this is to see if high heart rates treadmill training can potentially decrease progression. Okay, so this is one of the only progression studies that's out there. The people that are in this are not yet medicated, so it's very early Parkinson's. It is a year-long intervention, treadmill, and so we're doing the exercise intervention piece. Our colleagues at University Hospital Case Western are doing the clinical piece. We just are getting almost set up to ready to go, a couple more pieces and parts, but we're pretty excited about this. And again, it's looking at kind of how exercise intensity can maximize benefits for individuals with Parkinson's. Okay, so just to summarize, you know, we know that exercise can promote symptom improvement in Parkinson's and potentially neuroplasticity, which is the goal of the SPARKS-3 trial. However, a lot of different exercises are helpful, but it's not one exercise is not one size fits all. Exercise therapy, because the individuals are individualized and they have different levels of progression, exercise therapy must be individualized. It must be adaptive as well. And so we're using technology to try to determine not only what type of exercise people need, but their optimal exercise prescription and exercise intensity for those individuals. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions, but I just want to briefly mention my collaborators. Hey, I am an exercise physiologist and a neurobiologist. Luckily, I have good engineers on my team. Hassan and Arif at KHS Technologies, they actually built the newest prototype. Ken Laparo's a computer science professor at Case Western, and Asif Sheikh, I mentioned, is a neurologist at the VA. Fred DeCenzo is also another engineer that's worked on the bikes since the beginning. I couldn't do any of this without my students, including former students like Sarah, but these are the current students that we have right now, and a former postdoc, Jin Kim, also helped with a lot of this work. And then lastly, funding agencies, we couldn't do it without them. So I appreciate all of that support. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ridgel. This was wonderful. It's as you were giving your presentation, I mean, it's been a while since you and I've had the chance to kind of talk about, you know, research progression and you know, what's happening and where things are going. One thing that stood out initially, you're talking about the changes in entropy, basically modulating the motor work for the individual who's riding. Just out of curiosity, did you have you had any conversations with, say, Dr. Jetner at Kent State about maybe getting some blood samples to look at some of those mitochondrial markers? So it caught my attention.
Yeah, actually, that's a good idea, Sarah. Yeah, so we haven't done that, but I will tell you that right before COVID hit, we actually got a internal pilot grant with Dr. Pontevisca in the biology department.
Okay.
And she does genomic research, and she's one of those people who believes that, you know, you can use genomics and kind of virus exposure to kind of predict clinical outcomes. So we proposed a study where we would get blood and she would do those genomics. So obviously we haven't done that, but we still are going to. And so, you know, we easily could, you know, just take some of that sample and have Dr. Jaitner do those markers. So that's a great idea.
It would be incredibly interesting. We just we're waiting to hear back on an NIAR 21. I'm sure I could talk to my coworkers, colleagues, and say, hey, here's some markers that would be ideal to look at. I have additional questions, but I want to make sure I open it up to the floor here. So additional questions from our group.
I'll start off with one. Thanks so much for the presentation. It was very intriguing. I'm curious on the entropy with the force cycling with the tandem version, was it assessed by any chance? during
It was.
how was
Yeah, so actually that was the original reason why we programmed entropy into the dynamic bike. And we actually have a paper, I can send it to Sarah. We have a paper where we did that. And we showed on the tandem study that the individuals who had the greatest entropy of cadence did show the greatest improvement in their motor symptoms.
super interesting. What part of the partner aspect influenced motivation, do you think? So on the tandem, you're on there, there's this, I guess maybe it's just an implicit motivation from being with someone, that there's this research on partner involvement in rehab, and it shows that when partners are involved, it seems to improve outcomes in some populations. I'm wondering if that could explain some of the maybe benefit with that. Obviously with the bike by itself, you're not getting the partner, but
Right.
you're seeing the similar improvements, or are they less than with the tandem?
So it's a little hard to compare because the original tandem study was an 8-week study. Okay. And we haven't done that. Actually, the studies that we're doing with the VA is a 1-month study. So we're getting closer to that period in time. So we've seen smaller benefits in the shorter studies, but it's a shorter time period, so it's not that surprising. Although the motivation piece, I think, is important, and I've had a lot of people ask me about that. Part of the reason why we designed the new prototype, why we gamified it, is because we want to, give them a little bit more kind of internal motivation, the motivation of, trying to do that task. And I actually have a student who wanted to add to this study. We just got approved to start. She wanted to add some exercise motivation questionnaires. So we will start kind of delving into that. But you're certainly correct in that, the motivation of riding with another person was probably an important piece of it.
Thanks so much.
Angela, I wasn't here for the beginning. Sorry about that. So I might have missed this, but I think sometimes too, when you give somebody an extrinsic focus of attention, it helps them self-organize movement. And typically we find that like self-organized movement also has greater entropy, which is kind of cool. So the balloon thing, like the gamifying it, gives them sort of something else to focus on, and it's extrinsic to their own proprioception, which is kind of cool. And maybe even the competitiveness might do that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we could probably make it a little more intriguing. The engineers that I worked with weren't terribly ingenious in helping us come up with ideas, but we'll see how this one works. We haven't been able, as I said, to bring people with Parkinson's in yet, but I suspect that we may need to make it a little more motivating, or, I know that I've read some other papers where people have more goals, right? So my thought to the next level was, what if you had, if they could bring it up to a certain level, perhaps they could get, some sort of benefit, right? If they brought the balloon up, there would be some sort of, maybe they would get a star or some sort of merit badge or something to encourage them to stay with the motor a little bit more. So great idea. If you have any specifics, send them along.
I might do that. There's also some work that shows people with Parkinson's in particular do much better with smoother movement, right? So like when they're on a force cycle and somebody's helping them just a little bit, or the machine's helping them a little, and it's a smoother movement versus walking, or so that's interesting as well, because the feedback they get from the gamified task can be manipulated to be discrete or smooth. And I think you might see some differences there as well with how they view the feedback.
Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of work in the field of coordination where actually they're finding that the perceptual feedback you're getting is actually more important than sort of the muscles that are moving or the physiology of the actual movement. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I do agree with that. We, a lot of people have said to me, what's the mechanism for this? Because we actually see improvement in the upper extremity too, right? So it's not just lower extremity gait In fact, gait and posture don't show a huge benefit with this therapy. What we get, the biggest difference that we see is that reduction in tremor, reduction in bradykinesia, and reduction in rigidity in both the upper and lower extremity. So, we thought that maybe the mechanism was mostly, not a muscle based, but a proprioceptive based mechanism. We've been trying to figure out a way to measure that. So a little challenging to do that in humans, but that's kind of my working hypothesis.
Along those lines, Dr. Ridgel, like in terms of trying to measure proprioception, the issue what came to mind was Dr. Jay Jones and his thesis. I'll be honest, I don't know how it turned out, so I'm a little curious. Would you be able to kind of provide like a quick 30-second introduction and what you all
Yeah,
found?
so yeah, I just had a student was gonna present that at the research symposium. So he did a joint repositioning task before and after forced cycling, and what we found was that it wasn't overwhelming, but he did find that specifically with the he did many different joint repositioning. So I think at the 70%, so he was asking people, he would put that we were doing the knee joint. So he was positioning a knee joint at a given angle, and then they were blindfolded and he was asking them to match that joint angle in the opposite leg. And so he did find that there were improvements after the intervention at 70 degrees, but the smaller degrees, he wasn't getting a lot of change before and after. So, I mean, it didn't blow our minds. We tried to get it published, not terribly successful with that because it wasn't a dramatic improvement, but, I think there are challenges with joint repositioning task in that the error in measuring could be greater than the error that of the task. So if anybody has any ideas for something that's a little more focused than a joint repositioning task, because you err a degree, that's going to throw off your results.
What
Thanks for
about,
providing it. Oh, go ahead,
sorry.
Ruth.
So the joint reposition, they would have them put it, just so I'm clear, he would have them put it like a specific limb in space, and then they'd have to recreate it. Is that
Right. So usually what you do is, say, for example, you put somebody in like a dynamometer is usually how they do it. So you would position their knee at 90 degrees, their left knee at 90 degrees. They would be blindfolded. And then you would ask them to match that position of their left knee with their right knee without looking. And then you would measure the error. So did they make it to 90? Were they at 85? Were they at 80? So that's the task.
Previous labs, we realized that it might be a little bit more sensitive to note when they noticed movement. So it would be like 1 degree every 10 seconds or so. And I'm wondering if it's more the recognition of movement rather than knowing in space where they are in terms of proprioception. So that'd be, yeah, you kind of answered my question before I asked about the mechanism. And I'm really curious as to why they improve so much after an exercise bout. I'm trying to think more like oxygen to the muscles but yeah, the proprioception to it is just kind of intriguing.
Yeah, it's more than oxygen, and we said that over because it's if that were it, you wouldn't expect improvements in upper extremity necessarily. And I mean, you can see if somebody has a really bad tremor, you can see it just goes away. I mean, it's actually pretty dramatic. We try to focus on, because the tremor is the most dramatic change we've seen. We also see improvement in rigidity and bradykinesia, but if somebody has a pretty bad tremor, it just goes away for a period of time. So, yeah, I mean, we Stara started to dabble a bit, and we've measured BDNF, to try to see if that changed. But BDNF serum BDNF is such a challenge, and we saw so much variability that was hard to determine if there were actually differences versus just variability among people.
There's part of me that would be interested, at least doing a brief dive into adjunct therapies with, say, like resveratrol or some type of polyphenol, or even like CoQ10 with exercise, to see if there's anything worth exploring there without there being a ceiling effect. Basically,
Yeah.
without there being ceiling effect, and then just limiting the variability within just, the responses in general. But
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the variability in this
Challenges.
population, as with most human subject research, right?
Yeah.
As you all know, it makes us crazy. But so, I mean, that's really why we're trying to focus on how can we do individualized therapy? Because I think if we can figure out kind of the magic formula, that we could narrow that variability.
I think so too. Well, I'm doing a quick time check. We're at 1:02. Any final questions here for Dr. Ridgel? All right. With that, I just want to formally thank you again for taking the time to join us remotely. Hopefully, maybe who knows, maybe someday in person, come out and visit
Yeah,
here in Utah.
I know. I'd love to come out to Utah.
It's hard to beat the weather. I say, it's quite wonderful there. Let's see. I think I got the recording